All right, sweet. So for real this time, I welcome up the first speaker of the affirming team.
100 years ago, women didn't have the right to vote and little to no political standing. Look where we are today and imagine what life would look like in 2125. 3 substantive points from our side. Firstly, on how society will have greater innovation. Secondly, on how society tends towards equality. And thirdly, Isabella will provide you a split on greater globalization and interconnections. But before that, 3 points of setup. Firstly, what do we stand for? As the average person who lives in a society, we would prefer to be born in 100 years' time. Why? What could this look like? This could be in Gaza. It could be in Pakistan or New Zealand. We judge whether or not we prefer to be born in 100 years' time based on quality of the average person's life, right? But then secondly, on status quo, I think the average quality of life has improved very much from 100 years ago. So while it's not perfect, we think that in another 100 years, society's going to develop more and progress and get better. This looks like how most you can be born in a war with 14,000 children dying of famine in Gaza, of most populations and communities in India and China being the largest. But then thirdly, ultimately, we care about a world where of the quality of life and the world that you're born with, but also beyond that, 80 years time, your lifespan. Team Hawke tells you that we prefer the average person to prefer to be born in 2125. I'll take that POI.
Yeah. Do you think the rich or the poor generally have better access to societal developments like computers or AI?
I think that I don't think how this largely applies, but also in the future, likely due to more technology developing, more people will have access to it. More people will be able to gain it because technology is developing and becoming accessible to the most number of people. I'll talk more about this in my second point. But on greater innovation, for context, innovation entails things like healthcare, tech, and drastically increases a person's quality of life, right? 3 reasons. Firstly, in doing innovations or getting rid of ideas is extremely hard. Why is this? Because they're this information is patented and stored into libraries, into archives, into the internet, etc. It's the only way to move forward is to progress or maintain stuff. So it's way easier to develop stuff or make it better to be more efficient or cheaper, but also creating entirely new things, right? But then secondly, as time progresses, every more people will get educated because every person that is educated will be able to educate their children, and generally we'll have more people being educated. This is better for innovation and they're able to innovate, they're able to improve society and give people a better quality of life. This can look even simple things knowing how to build a home in a good location, knowing how to handle your finances better. Under the status quo, people who live in poorer conditions with unclean conditions and no vax, people who live in are worse off. The vast majority of people aren't educated, aren't able to innovate or progress society in a really beneficial way. We get more education and we get more innovation in the future. This is more likely. But then thirdly, over time, as we enact more infrastructure and technology, slowly this will largely get easier to do. Why is this? In the status quo, if you build roads in a poorer African country, this road will likely in the future have more developments. This will have greater modes of transports for more people. People are likely to be able to get to work, get to school easier. This will mean that more people are incentivized to go and make these developments because it makes life easier. But then also we are able to fix instead of focusing on facing the basic needs of people, you're likely to go beyond that and have solutions where people are able to thrive. What are some of the outcomes of this? I think as seen in the developed world, you get an increased ability to do this in the developing world so you can go and solve issues
POI.
globally. This is important considering like the vulnerability and scale of this. There's so many vulnerable people in like so many large populations in countries such as like India, which are extremely huge, but then for outcomes you likely get like more effective, cheaper innovations, so like products are more developed, and like this looks like firstly like genetically modified crops, you like improve horticulture. Then secondly, on medicine, like you get AI like getting better at like diagnosing illnesses. This makes it more efficient and easier, and like the healthcare and medical community like grows and develops, right? You get like more environmentally friendly development, and communities like focus on more sustainability because they want to like compete in an environment, and so they're likely to do what's best. This is important when we consider that the most people are suffering are the most vulnerable populations. We need greater innovation, and we get this on side affirmative by solving issues that can come up without like to solve any issues that can come up. But then secondly, on my point about like how society tends to focus on like equality, I think for context, we're able to prove that most people are likely going to live in better if we're likely to win that most people live in better conditions, we win this point. Firstly, on political power, it's harder to take back political power than it is to gain it, right? Because like in political power, you have like more say, you have more accountability mechanisms, you have more education than like the average person. In 100 years of time, people will move into more like global solutions that go without like political systems and have a better say in issues, and they're able to like advocate for more like for issues that like impact their life the greatest, such as healthcare and climate change. 100 years ago, like women didn't have the right to vote. People like could not advocate for themselves. It's harder to take back political power because like if you try to take back this power from women in this position, it'd be extremely hard now because women are in parliament. They have like the ability to stand their ground. But then secondly, society has like a more efficient and comparative advantage because society is better when it's more equal, right? People contribute more and equally to society, and this maximizes utility, right? It's incentive for like everyone to equalize, right? I think the wealthy will try to equalize because they want like society to be more stable, and they want like society to progress more so that they can make like more benefits and more profits. Like what does this look like? We have like incentives for everyone to equalize. So this looks like a world where like brands are giving lots of like banks are giving lots of loans to like developing nations. Then thirdly, on like guilt, right? I think people generally like people feel guilt when they see other people suffering, right? It's just like a human emotion and like a human like evolution thing that you want to live in communities, you want to live in families, and that you want to live in societies, and you want to see people like be able to survive and be okay. So people generally don't want people to be drowning. But then what are the outcomes of this? I think we get less extreme harms, but people are better off economically. This means that the possibility to be born in a third world country is less because you have like more equality in society. You have greater innovations. This means like less inequality. It means people of other countries are feeling better comparatively when they see that people are in worse conditions through the ups and downs of like economic downturn. Because there's greater equality, the poor are less affected by like booms or like blast of like economy. I think we win this debate independently, even if if the life of the average person doesn't change significantly. The chance to be born in less extremes and in less poverty means we win this debate. So proud to affirm.
Awesome. I thank the speaker for their speech, and I welcome up the first speaker of the negating team.
I think that the primary problem with the F case we just heard is that they failed to explain to us like actually how any of this development gets created, what the actual like incentives on the people who we see are primary corporations trying to make money, who are driving this development is, on how this development actually gets to the poorest people in our societies who need it. Right. I'm going to start with some rebuttal and characterizations. Then I'm going to go through 3 points in my speech. Firstly, on why we see like a really high likelihood of really widespread and really bad events happening in 100 years. Secondly, why we think that like society just generally gets worse across the board for most people. And thirdly, why we actually see increased inequality. Note this is going to be like quite responsive to their main push on equality that we heard. But I'm going to start by addressing this idea of like innovation, of all of this healthcare and tech and education that's going to happen. Firstly, like, and I'll explain this more in my first point on why it's actually like corporations doing this, but we think it's really expensive, most of these things. Like, even if we create a massive new healthcare procedure, we think the only people who can actually access it are the rich, are the people living in a like really rich country that's able to have a free public healthcare system, which we see actually isn't a lot of them. We think that we're going to need some really good mix to why this actually trickles down to the worst people in society, that this needs to make a massive change for. And we also think that like lots of development of technology can also equally be bad, and I'll get onto that later. So, starting with some characterizations. Firstly, we think that the like rate of technological development is ever increasing and is actually happening at a really fast rate. We think that's really important because it like determines how quickly our societies are able to adjust to that and how quickly we're able to utilize this tech in a good way. No, thank you. Secondly, we think that increasingly it is like corporations that are doing most of this development, that are doing the implementation of these technologies. We think this because like ultimately corporations increasingly now have more money than governments, have more means, because they have like big ways of collecting lots of money from people. We have big corporations with lots of money. They're the ones driving the development. They're the ones who get to choose what they're developing. They're trying to do it for profit, not for good means. Before I move on, I'll take a POI.
Is there any period of time in the past you would rather be born?
I think there is a very strong case for saying that I would rather be born in a era where we lived as hunter-gatherers, where actually our like biological needs were aligned with the lifestyles that we lived in, that where we didn't have like social media trying to like that isolated us, that divided us as a society, that made us unhappy. I think there's a very strong case for that. I think I would accept that deal. Firstly then, on why we think there's a really high likelihood of catastrophic events. Right? I think it's important to note throughout this whole point that as much as I will use examples, there are probably a whole lot of new issues that we don't know about right now that are going to like emerge in the next 100 years that are going to be equally as disastrous. 100 years ago, we knew nothing about climate change, we knew nothing about nuclear weapons. So, firstly, there's just like increased power for people to do bad things. We think we have massive capabilities for actors to like literally blow up the world with nuclear weapons. We think this is a really, really bad thing. We think that didn't exist 100 years ago. We think there are like far more ability to use weapons to cause mass destruction, to do terrible things. We think this like inherently makes it more likely that they will happen. Secondly, I think it's really hard to regulate and to actually like get countries and people to agree to not use these things. We think in the case of like chemical weapons, it took an like event like World War I, where we saw the like horrific effects of using things like poison gas to actually get countries to agree to stop using them. Even now we don't see that that is complete. We can't afford to do that in the case of something like nuclear weapons. Thirdly, something like climate change is like a really, really bad event that is coming for us that we don't see any substantial change on so far. We don't think we're going to be able to achieve that change for a variety of reasons, but most basically just because like developed countries, the ones creating these emissions, won't actually like choose this over the more direct, more immediate effects. They can always build a seawall. They're not going to be willing to make change. Fourthly, we think, and this sort of links into the first mechanism, that if we simply have more actors, especially non-state actors, especially corporations, especially like terrorist groups, that have the greater capability to utilize weapons of mass destruction, because we think it just gets easier to make these weapons, to use these weapons over time. These like actors are far more able, far more likely to do this because they have less good systems, because they don't have so strong democracies. They're more, even just the more actors you have, the more likely one of them makes a bad decision, does something that is really, really bad for the world.
POI.
Fifthly, like the people pushing development are corporations. We think this means that they are like inherently incentivized to create bad things. We think a lot of the like development happening in the military right now is done by corporations who produce weapons, who like aren't really beholden, like can sell them to whoever pays the highest price, who aren't like a government beholden to anyone. They're simply trying to turn a profit. We think that is increasingly going to be true in the next 100 years. We think that is increasingly means that bad actors will get their hands on those weapons and be able to do bad things. Sixthly, we think that as like systems that govern every part of our lives get more complex, there's simply more room for failure. We think the more that we trust AI with running our hospitals, with running our trains, with driving our cars, with like flying our military drones, the more likelihood there is to screw up. We think this applies not just to AI, but also to complex computer systems, which are also like very likely to fail. Why do we think this is so important? We think that like the scale of this is just increasing massively. We think something like nuclear weapons was unheard of 100 years ago. We think even like just the things that exist now, as they become more and more easy to do, are going to pose a massive risk. That isn't even including the new things that are going to be created, that are going to be developed. We think the scale of this is really, really big. It affects like, if we have a large-scale nuclear war, that affects basically everyone on the planet. It affects them really badly. We also think that if this happens, like any time between now and the next 100 years, you can have something like radioactive fallout that exists for a very long time, that has very far-reaching implications. We think this is really, really bad. We think we can win on this alone if we just show that the chance is so high that you shouldn't take the risk, that you should choose to live now, because there is a small chance you could be living in a dystopian future.
Pure.
Secondly, onto my second point, on why we just see societal change for the worse. Now, note this like is responsive to their first point on technology. We think as much as there are like the occasional developments that, you know, cure cancer or whatever, there are also developments that just look like social media where it's actually hurting us. Few mechanisms for this. Firstly, as I sort of told you earlier, we are designed biologically to be happy as hunter-gatherers, to eat the food that is put in front of us, to like save up food, to be social creatures. We think a lot of technology in modern life is directly working against that, is actively making us unhappy people, right? We think we see this in the like smartphones that cause us to spend less time with people, to spend more time in a room alone, that the obesity crisis, because we don't have the like societal or biological mechanisms to be able to deal with the vast amounts of food we are exposed to. We think this just makes people really unhappy. Secondly, like, we also think there's corporate interest driving a lot of development, a lot of tech development. We think that Apple doesn't really care about the effect, or like Facebook or TikTok doesn't really care about the effect that its social media platforms has on someone's mental health. We think that only now are countries actually starting to like regulate these things 40 years, 30 years after they were created. We think that is too long. We think this is really bad because it simply means that like even people in rich countries who get all this development they're trying to claim are still going to be unhappy because of all this technology. We think this is the second path to victory. Thank you very much.
Cool. I thank the speaker for their speech, and I welcome up the second speaker from the affirmative team.
Oh no. Hello. The negating team who would rather be a hunter or gatherer, but the fact is that in the status quo, some people have to live with the fact that they will only live for about 20 years, while others face amazing benefits of living in a well-developed society where they're going to live for 80 years. I think that's what they have to stand for on side negating. We would much rather stand for a more equal world in which more people have access to innovation, rather than the kind of harms that they talk about on their side of the house, where innovation is kept within corporations, where only the rich benefit. We would much rather live in 100 years' time. A couple of things to talk about then. Firstly, on innovation, where it is going to exist, the type of people who are developing it, and whether it is good or bad. Secondly then, on the types of events that we are likely to get in the future, whether they are more likely to happen then or now, but also more importantly, the extent to which they are going to be able to harm us in the future. Then I will move on to talk about the sort of last point we just heard bring up about general unhappiness and like a more future-thinking world, before moving on to my split point about how we will have greater globalization and interconnectedness, and then how this also specifically deals with some of the problems that we heard bring up by negating. Firstly then, on innovation. They tell us that any innovation we are able to claim on side affirming isn't actually realised for the large groups of people that we are able to claim. I don't think this is true for a couple of reasons. Firstly, because it becomes much cheaper in order to build it, which means that people in more developing countries, those who have less access to resources, are able to build this. Why? Because you have things like the machines that are able to build it aren't just like made and having to be handmade and specifically made for specific projects, but they might be mass produced. You have like economies of scale and they're able to be used by a wide variety of people. But secondly, the knowledge and the patents and the information that goes into those things, the patents, for example, might have expired, which means that people are now able to use that knowledge and create it themselves. But secondly, we told you at Unchica, right, that you're able to build upon this knowledge in order to create an even cheaper or a more efficient version of the product. This might mean that you have to use less resources, less oil in order to like fund the machine that you're trying to create, which means that there's less cost in general for you as a consumer to use this innovation. I think at the end of this, what you should believe then is that their side of the house, they have to stand for innovation being held with the wealthy. On our side of the house, we benefit the poorest, we benefit the majority of those in the world who are ultimately the poorest, who live in developing countries like India and China. Secondly, then, they tell you that innovation in general is bad because we have things such as AI that are likely to fail. I don't think we really heard a sufficient response on why AI, for example, is likely to be bad, rather than just to say, well, no, we're spreading it across a wide variety of things. Perhaps it fails. It's not very likely to fail for a couple of reasons. Firstly, due to government restriction and laws, they not only exist now, but we think they become more extensive in the future. Why? Because people are able to spend more time and more expertise on developing policy that is going to be able to specifically address things such as AI. We get people doing entire degrees in studying AI and the harms of it, who are now able to uniquely address the sort of harms that might come with it. Secondly, we tell you that the capability is reserved specifically to devices, and you're given specific instructions in order to carry out specific tasks. This means that if you tell an AI to drive a train, it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to take over the world, right? You still have that capability to restrict its ability in order to do things. But also, we think that the alternative that they have to stand for is that there are innate human flaws, right? That means that when they tell you that AI driving a train is bad, on the other side, you have a human driving a train having to deal with ethical problems of the trolley problem, for example. They have to, where the AI is able to make an objective decision and come to a conclusion, and it might be better at weighing up and having a variety of information at its hands in order to make that decision faster, in order to benefit the most amount of people. I think, therefore, you have to believe that they haven't proved sufficiently that innovation is likely to be negative. Rather, all of the reasons we've given you about how society trends towards equality, we get more people advocating for positive change and positive innovation, you're likely to get more of that in 100 years' time. Moving on then to do we likely to get more sort of bad events such as economic disaster or wars or environmental collapse. I think firstly, we tell you that you are not likely to get this for a couple of reasons. Firstly, they told you that you have more power, and this means that these things are more likely to happen. One, more power means that weapons are more advanced. It also means that people are less likely to use them. This was the whole concept of the Cold War, right? You have all of these really powerful weapons. It meant that nobody actually did anything. It meant that very few people actually got harmed, because you know that if you use the weapon on someone else, then it is also going to be used against you. But also, if they're able to claim that we're going to get large development in weapons, I don't see why we're not going to be able to get large development when it comes to weapons destruction or identifying weapons or preventing them from being able to cause harm, things like drones that are able to go and directly target tank machinery, for example, are likely to become more accurate and better able to do those sort of things so we can prevent war. But also we might get stuff like AI being able to analyse war and predict who it is going to be harming and therefore prevent those sorts of things. Also, we think that just historical harms, when you see that something has been used historically in a negative way, you learn from those things and you become more conservative as a government and are less likely to want to use those things. I think, therefore, you have to believe that even though maybe people have more developed capabilities, they have those in a variety of ways, which means that they're not going to be able to use them for greater harm, and we're not going to get all of these sorts of bad events in terms of war happening. Secondly, they tell you that you are going to get the most developed countries affected, and they're just going to be building seawalls or whatever, which means they're not going to focus on climate change in a global context. A couple of responses to this. Firstly, in terms of in the status quo, we tell you that there is already existing things such as like major floods, like Bangladesh gets flooded frequently and they live on a floodplain, they still have to deal with the harms of climate change in the status quo. But the change that we get over time in 100 years' time is all the sorts of things that we were speaking to you about, right? About like equality and development and innovation, which means that sort of seawalls that they tell you are able to prevent climate change or prevent the harms of it mean that every country is now able to do that, which means that you don't get the sort of harms that they're telling you about where climate change is localized in the poorest countries. I think therefore we have proved to you sufficiently that even if we get any like sort of bad events, we're better able and more willing to act on them. We're able to use our tech to mitigate and solve these problems. We can predict extreme hazards and things like weather events, for example, and we are much more prepared in order to deal with these things after 100 years of gathering knowledge. Moving on then to this sort of unhappiness point. Before I move on to this, I will take your POI.
If it takes 20 years to properly regulate AI because you have to train someone to be experienced in it, how long will it take us to regulate the next big threat?
Well, I think as I've already spoken about, you build and you learn on the more things and the more information you have. So maybe you like learn from AI and you apply sort of concepts from that, but it means that it becomes quicker and quicker in order to develop these sorts of things. But lastly then on unhappiness, I think we tell you that as over time you don't necessarily become more susceptible to things like social media because you have like more regulation for social media, which I've already talked about. You have more studies on the long-term harms of it, and you also see the long-term harms of it. So the sort of like mental health stuff, companies then have to be held responsible for that because in the long term people are likely to leave their platforms. In the status quo, they remain on their platforms because they haven't seen the long-term harm yet. Lastly then quickly on globalization and interconnectedness. I think as existing trade routes become more established and cheaper and we develop our economies further, which means we have to spread and go to economies of scale and go overseas, it means we get more trade and more interconnectedness, which is important because it means that people are less likely to want to go to war, they're less likely to do all these sorts of harms and these big threats and events that they are talking about on their side of the house, and also any sort of harms to an economy are spread out, like the EU, if there is sort of unsymmetric harms to a member state, the entire EU as a whole takes a burden of those, which means that any sort of booms or busts are spread out more widely and we get more people benefiting as a result of them.
Well, I thank the speaker for their speech, and I welcome up second Meg.
AF's big push in this debate has been that on their side, they get better equality. They get the natural sort of arc of history that improves society because people care about others and all of these great things. Not only is this like firstly depending on the fact that like all of our harms about just like horrendous catastrophe and a bunch of bad things don't happen, that all of their points I'm going to tell you like depend on. This doesn't matter because we get all of these harms of like a nuclear apocalypse, of like lots of people being depressed because of social media. All of these things we weigh more highly, and there's like 500 million ways we win this debate, right? Okay, what am I going to do? 3 points of clash. We're going to start with like the innovation that we see on both sides and the consequences or lack of consequences. We're then going to talk about like equality and inequality, their sort of big push, and I'm going to flip all of those points, and then we're going to talk about what we think is really damaging, what we weigh really highly, which is all of these points about like potential catastrophe. Okay, innovation and like consequences. We basically presented this idea that we don't think this innovation is going to trickle down. We don't think, no thank you, we don't think that these like poorer, more developing places are going to get this information, are going to get this like development. We firstly heard that like they will, but it just takes time. I think it is important that we note it does take time, right? It is that at the point where it takes time that there is more inequality in the world. We think inequality itself is really, really dangerous because what we think this means is we think people see inequality and they hate this, right? This looks like someone feeling really, really negative attitudes towards like someone who's rich, for example, because they have like are better at everything because they've genetically engineered themselves. We think this leads to like a breakdown in like social harmony. We think there's a bunch of harms that come directly from this. And then secondly, we think that at the point in which certain people have way more power over others because there is this gap in time in which development occurs, we think this allows people to exploit others. We think this is how we see things like colonialism happening because there are countries, there are people who have the power to exploit others. This like we think as time passes on, this gets more and more common, this gets more and more likely, right? Like lots of similar things on this idea of taking time. We had this idea that, the social media, all of the problems with depression and social media doesn't matter because these companies will be held responsible, there will be laws that will be passed, all of this cancels it out. Note that like we have had social media for like 10 years, we have ballooning rates of mental health, all of these things are really bad at the point in which we get lots and lots of new innovation that it takes time to like get the experts, it takes time to get the law, it takes time to get the public support. That's really dangerous. If we continue to have all of these negative effects over 100 years, there's a lot of harm that they have to like deal with, right? Finally, I'd just like to touch on this idea that like there's going to be more trade. I think this is like relatively, I think this misses the fact that just because there's been more trade now, that doesn't mean it's going to continue in the future. And actually like there hasn't been more trade now. I think we see that people like Trump, there is actually inherently nothing about that like about the world that makes you want to trade with countries more, apart from the fact that it's stable, right? I think we're going to give you a bunch of mix of why the world is not going to be stable, why it's not going to be there's not going to be a rules-based order. I think we're clearly seeing that when you see people like Trump elected, probably partially off the back of misinformation and disinformation off like things like social media and probably inequality that leads to like the social disharmony we talked about, right? Okay, I think we've dealt with pretty much everything they've said there. Then let's like talk about this idea of equality, right? I think they had this point that basically there'll be a bunch of people who like feel pity for a bunch of people who aren't doing as well, right? We think firstly that this I think we can mitigate this to a certain extent by saying that these people care fundamentally more about themselves than they care about other people. We think our best line of response to this though is that like this all depends on the fact that you have you're aware of these issues, right? At the point in which you feel bad for people dying from climate change in like a country like Bangladesh, it is far too late. At the point at which and then secondly, on the idea that you can actually make change. At the point in which because like nuclear technology has been around for like 50 years, 100 years, you just give more opportunity for non-state actors to get nuclear technology, to get chemical weapons. At the point in which you feel guilty for that, there isn't, you can't stop it. We don't think this guilt does anything important, and we think that's why none of that particularly matters. We think the other big push we've heard on this idea of equality and social issues is that as people progress, they basically do better socially. Right? They're nicer to people. I think we're just going to assume that this is because they're richer or something like that. We're not entirely clear on that. Firstly, we don't think that people are richer. We think these people are more likely to be reactionary because we've just given you a bunch of mechanisms of why these people are likely to be in a really bad situation. There's likely to be social harmony. But secondly, and most importantly, it's way, way easier to revert to old prejudices, right? To revert to old stereotypes and old ways of being of populism and stuff than to break down already existing things. It's way easier to be racist than to get rid of racism. We think that's why fundamentally you see over the span of history thousands of years of racism with a tiny little blip and when there's slightly less racism. I'll take a POI now.
Why do people decide to have kids in the status quo?
Because there's a biological urge to have kids. Okay, now I think let's go onto this idea of catastrophe. I think we've proved why all of their things that they've said about equality aren't necessarily we've kind of flipped them. I'd like to note that all of the stuff I gave earlier on social innovation about like why there's going to be more inequality, why that leads to bad things, why that leads to social harmony, also affects all of these ideas about social equality. They've just given us a bunch of weighing of why they care about this so much. And so I think that's like really helpful for our side. But at the point at which we have catastrophe, in which we have like humanity getting like absolutely like wiped out or murdered by like the point we get like the Terminator kind of stuff, I think that is the point at which we win this debate. Why is that not in a movie? Why is that a realistic scenario, right? Okay, let's talk about AI. 2 responses of why AI won't do really bad things, right? Firstly, we had there's going to be law and protection from the government. 2 things. Firstly, as we've already explained, these kind of things are going to be controlled by like companies, by non-state actors increasingly, right? We haven't heard response to this. These people have less of alignment with the good of the people than like than the government does, right? Second, and also these laws just like don't exist, right? That's the whole point of we're saying it takes time for these laws to exist. It takes time. By the time that already happens, it's too late. Then we had this idea like, oh, the AI is going to be like just driving a train. I think we just have to understand like, how does this actually work? How do we actually see like AI destroying society in like the worst case scenario? What this looks like is it gets told drive a train and then takes that, oh my job is to drive a train well. At this point, because it's an AI and doesn't understand that we care about some things more than driving a train well, it then goes and like kills a bunch of all the humans so it can't run over people and therefore get bad things. We think that is like a completely realistic scenario that could totally happen that they have to grapple with. It's really bad if like all of the humans start getting hunted by this AI, right? But secondly, this also looks like when school is just like, at school, AI is used, right? People just use AI. They don't know how to deal with it. Or it looks like things like AI girlfriends, where you get a bunch of people who like don't have social skills anymore because they just have an AI girlfriend. There is not enough time to adapt to this. That is the fundamental mechanism that we haven't heard responded to at all, that there is not enough time to adapt to this technology, and that is why I would choose to live now. Thank you very much.
Cool, I thank the speaker for their speech, and I welcome up the third affirmative.
Peter, why did you tell me to use so much paper? Ultimately, if you buy the whole case and believe that bad events are going to happen a lot with increasing frequency and increasing severity, what this means is we're going to have a nuclear fallout in 10 years, and then we're going to be hunter-gatherers in 100 years. We win on their metrics in regardless, right? 3 things to do in my speech. 1, why average quality of life is going to increase, or like why tech will be good for like good in general. 2, on equality, and 3, on how even if you buy even if you don't believe, even if you buy all of their case, we still win. So 1, like we hear this big contention on whether tech will do more harm than good. Few things here. One, I think like the biggest pushback we hear against it is that like we just don't have enough time to respond to it. We have 100 years. That's plenty of time. Like the average bill in like the US, the US House takes like 4 years to pass. We have 100. We can pass bills fast enough. And I think especially given like we know climate change exists now, we know AI is harmful now. We can make these bills now, and like even if AI changes massively, even if climate change increases massively, we still have the basic idea of like regulating it. And I think like regulating it is this big idea that we've just been like not really responded to from negating. They just tell us that like, oh, okay, so corporations are going to do it. Corporations are bad, so like some things are bad. governments can regulate corporations, right? Like corporations can't just do whatever they want under the status quo. They're not going to do whatever they want in 100 years. I don't think that like you can buy any of that.
On that,
But like regardless, like even if corporations can do whatever they want, well, corporations likely to act well. Like generally, like what you need to believe about corporations is that the way they make money is by selling stuff to people, right? Because people have money. The way corporations make stuff is by answering a problem people have, because that means
on that,
that means they like people buy that. This looks like Apple having an incentive to make a really good phone that's really useful to use, because then people buy it. It looks like medicine companies like wanting to make really good medicine, because if they make bad medicine, people won't buy it and then they don't get money. So like corporate incentives, even if they aren't just we want to make the good place, but rather we want to make profit. If the profit aligns with the good of the people, because people buy stuff, people have the money and they use it to increase the quality of life. That's how money is used in exchange for goods and services, right?
on that,
Sure, I'll take your view.
if you could just pass a bill, why does climate change still exist?
I think like one is like you have a lot of boomers in the House of Representatives. In 100 years, they'll all be dead. Everyone in 100 years would have lived with climate change their whole life. They're much more likely to pass a bill. Secondly, like we've been aware of climate change for like 10, 15 years. Most people haven't been thinking about it too much. In 100 years, we will be able to pass houses. And secondly, like we have made measures to for climate change. We have improved a lot on like using green energy. We've reduced our carbon footprint a lot. Look, like we are not using CFCs in fridges, so we don't have a hole in the ozone anymore. We have been making changes, and they can't just say like, oh, the world is really bad now, so it's gonna be even worse in 100 years.
On that,
And I think, like, lastly on that a lot of tech just can't really be used negatively. If we take, for example, predictive AI that like is able to diagnose cancers much more effectively, I don't think if we an AI that would be able to predict, look at an image and see and predict whether it is likely to contain cancer in a higher accuracy or faster than humans, can't really be used badly. Worst case scenario, you have slightly more false positives. I don't think that's a massive issue. I don't think they can use it particularly harmfully. I think there are most innovations just don't have a big capacity to do harm. So most technology is just likely to be good regardless. Now, moving on to before I move on, they gave us a lot of things about social media is really bad. Well, social media exists under the status quo. So if they really want to believe, if they really want you to believe that social media is bad, that's happening right now. A lot of their harms in general were about stuff that is happening right now. So if they are going to change at all, it's probably for the better. And secondly, I don't think they've given us enough reasonings on why not being a hunter-gatherer is bad, or why social media is bad. Because I can meet and talk with my friends on social media. I think that's a good thing. I don't think they gave us enough reasoning on why that's unlikely to be true. Moving on to the point on extremes, right? Because a big idea here was they say the poor don't get as much benefits from innovation, so it's not a really good idea. So one thing is under the status quo, inequality is already really bad. I don't think they can claim, inequality is gonna be so much worse, especially because they've only told us inequality is bad and inequality is likely to exist. I think they needed to prove inequality would be significantly worse, and they haven't been able to do that. I think secondly, we've given you plenty of mechanisms from Anshika and from Isabella on why it is unlikely to happen. One, because at the point where inequality has been reduced, it is much harder to introduce it again. So you're just less likely to have that. Secondly, it's just there is a general incentive to maximize capacity and maximize value, and the easiest way to do that is by increasing equality, right? Because at the point where everyone's labor value is shared equally, you just are more able to utilize it. I think that's pretty simple. I think the incentive has not been really engaged with at all, so you kind of have to buy it. And lastly, we had this point of human empathy. We tell you that even if it's unlikely to happen. Humans like to share with stuff. Like when a baby sees another baby crying, they are likely to come and offer them to help or cry with them. Even if you don't buy any of the other mechanisms on why it's good to have, we're likely to have less inequality, because people just have a natural inclination to share and reduce inequality, it is likely to happen on our side. What this means is that even if you don't buy any of our mechs on why the tech is gonna improve the lives so much.
On that.
Even if we just get less extreme harms happening happening right now in Gaza or in extreme poverty or in other scenarios, we have to win this debate, because I think if you could flip a coin and either live right now in New Zealand or in Gaza, or live in a place that is just slightly somewhere between New Zealand and Gaza, you probably just will not take the big risk, right? And then lastly, how we win regardless of whether inequality or average of quality of life goes up. I think generally what you have to believe is that the majority of negating case has just been the future is going to be bad. I think they needed to prove why the future is going to be worse than the present, and they haven't engaged with that at all, right? The present is bad. We have social media. We're far from hunter-gatherers. I don't think they can claim that we are hunter-gatherers now, so I don't think they can claim a massive benefit there. I don't think they've given you any reasons on why we should prioritize the status quo, because we do have the big wars, we do have the climate change, we don't have the benefits we get on our side. We win this debate.
I thank the speaker for their speech, and I invite up third Neg to conclude the substantive portion of this bill.
Okay, just before I get into my overall contingency layout, something I'd like you to remember is that if they manage to prove that equality is going to happen and that all of this technology is going to trickle down, that also means that non-state actors like Al-Qaeda have nukes, right? And all of the incredible bad things which are going to be developed. And I think that's something which is really important I'm going to get into later. But okay, look, they're trying to win this debate by proving that development is going to be great, the world's going to be awesome, development, development, development. So, we are going to explain to you that A, this development is not going to be good. It's actually going to be actively bad for society. Even if you don't believe that, it's not going to reach everybody. That makes society even worse. And actually, even if that development does reach people, the gap between the top and bottom is getting worse, and that's actually worse than right now, where it's like this, even if the overall average standard is raised. And even if you do believe that development is going to reach everyone, like I said, that means Al-Qaeda has nukes, which is probably bad, and stuff like that, and another 5 mechs, only one of which has been responded to, are going to mean that the world just kind of doesn't exist, which I think is fairly, I think I'm using this phrase right, logically prior to having a good world. Okay, so, first point of clash, innovation, then equality, then catastrophe, just those 3. Cool, innovation, what does this look like? Is this good? Now, they've told us development is good. Largely asserted, we gave you responses. First of all, we told you that development is actually often bad, right? Just because we are starting to do more things than we were doing before, that doesn't actually mean they're good. So we told you, for example, that stuff like social media has made our world today materially worse than it was 25 years ago. Thomas would like to live in the hunter-gatherer age. I'd like to live in the 80s, right? Like, not having to have people ringing me up all the time and scrolling through reels would probably be a materially better life for me. AI girlfriends is going to be the next social media. Those kinds of things are really horrible for society, and they're the things which uniquely develop on your side of the house. If you want me to talk about why it's worse in 100 years than today, AI girlfriends and all of the other types of social media that you have are worse. Furthermore, something I want you to remember, a central mech to our case, this is getting quicker and quicker and quicker, right? Like, this is a graph like this. I've been told not to use equations, but I'm sorry. It's a massive graph. It's going up and up and up and up at a greater rate, which means that today we've had one thing which revolutionized over 25 years, which makes society worse. You then have 5 every 25 years, and then 25 every 25 years. And that means that even if you believe that social media is kind of fine, 5 things which make society just as bad as social media does is totally not fine. So we don't think this development is going to be good. They've told us one mech, that companies are developing, companies want money. Now, yes, companies want money. Who has money? The rich. This means that companies are going to do whatever they can to make as much money as possible, which is probably from the rich. And so on their side of the house, we don't think that, like they have proposed, companies' incentives are aligned with the average Joe. Therefore, they're probably not going to be that good for society. Also, allegedly, they're involved with the average Joe, and also, thalidomide and social media and a bunch of other bad things companies have done totally happened, Lockheed Martin, all that jazz. So, we don't think innovation is going to be good. Notably, even if we lose this point, we don't think that's such a problem, because even if the innovation is great, in the next point of clash, not everyone gets it, and that's actually worse. But I'll take a POI before I get into that.
Why doesn't the USA assist Ukraine against Russia in the status quo?
Probably because Trump's kind of crazy. I think a lot of countries do things which aren't particularly rational, and also we can see that leaders are getting less and less rational as time goes on, and also have access to more and more powerful things. 25 years ago, the US probably would have helped Ukraine, Iran or whatever, versus on your side of the house, the leaders are getting more and more crazy, they're doing less and less, that's probably going to be worse on your side of the house in the future. It's just keeping on happening. Okay, equality. So, they've told us actually one mech here for why they're getting equality, and it's basically the guilt idea. And they've had a couple other peripheral things in here about how things just trickle down, right? Basically that as technology exists for longer and longer, it gets more and more involved in the person's everyday life, and so more people start to have it. We have two responses to the guilt thing. First of all, guilt really only works if you have a really visceral connection to that, right? That's another reason why people don't necessarily help Ukraine, is because we don't have such a visceral connection with that. However, Gaza, people totally do seem to have a visceral connection to, and yet we do nothing because we don't have the capacity to create change, right? In order to create change because of guilt, you have to be in a position of society to create that change. We don't think most of those people are. We think the rich people are probably benefiting from everyone else being, sucky, and so we don't think you're getting the guilt mech on your side of the house. Additionally, we told you two reasons why we actually don't think it's going to be equal, and these have gone unresponded except from just referring back to their case, which isn't really a response. So first of all, we told you it costs money to develop, and economies of scale basically mean that the people who are doing the development, the rich people, do more and more development, then because of that they can develop other things more cheaply. They do more and more development, develop, but notably, that's only a company. What does this mean? This means the gap widens, and we think this can be really simple stuff, like if Foodstuffs is able to develop computers into their cashier system before some dairy, Foodstuffs can then sell things more cheaply, and now the supermarkets have a massive advantage, a little advantage over the dairy, but then that accumulates over time, and in 25 years' time, dairies are still sticking prices on things and writing them by hand when they discount them past date, versus Foodstuffs has all of these fancy systems. And so we think this gap gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. What do we think this means? Ultimately, something they have failed to prove on their side of the house is why it's actually good for you to be in a society where you are so much further away from the upper class, even if your standard is raised. So we gave you some weighing a second, and I'm going to elaborate on it here. We think that fundamentally, if your society is so far away from what you are, right, if the upper class is so unattainable compared to where you are, you feel like society hates you. That's actually one of the primary problems with inequality, even if the average standard of living is higher. And what you guys are going to have on your side of the house is the upper class, and even just the bourgeois, if you're the proletariat, are so far above you that you are completely unattainable to get there. It's never going to happen. We think those are massive harms on your side of the house, and actually don't necessarily make the world better. We think a lot of people live fairly okay lives today, and we would rather they live fairly okay lives today and have some degree of social mobility than in your side of the house where they have absolutely no capacity to develop over time, and therefore spend their entire lives depressed in one class. And so actually, we think equality kind of goes on our side of the house anyway. And even if it doesn't, next point, catastrophe. Okay, this is most definitely the most important point in the debate. Why is this? Because, like I said, logical priority, I guess, and also fundamentally, we think the odds here are really important. We don't have to prove that this is certain. We also don't necessarily have to prove that it is a world-ending event. If we can prove that there are going to be, one more World War III, perhaps not the nuke kind, that's really bad, right? We think that that's something which they can't way up on their side of the house. And actually, because we think that a lot of people live fairly okay lives today so long as they're not at war, that kind of World War III, which includes everyone, is really bad on your side of the house. And even if it happens in, 1 out of the 2,500 worlds if you're Doctor Strange, that's still debate-winning material for us. Okay, we gave you 6 mechs for this. We told you stuff is just getting more powerful. You can do more things today than you could before. We told you that development outpaces regulation, which has only got responded to at 3rd, but I'll whip that in a second. Then climate change, then companies are evil, then non-state actors, and then AI and technology. They've responded to 2 of these. Okay, first of all, AI isn't going to fail. They told you regulations and rules, capacity restricted, aka they don't do everything, and then the comparative is human false. 5 responses for you here. First of all, we have told you consistently, and haven't explained why, that bad things in development are always outpace regulation. This is because in order to regulate something, something horrible has to happen. We didn't regulate chemical weapons until World War I happened. Secondarily, people are starting AGI like they're totally doing more things. Secondarily, sorry, I'm just getting into the most powerful one. A human does one thing, we're getting AI to do many things, therefore an AI failure is catastrophic because it does a huge amount of things. One human, not so bad. Okay, then they've told us that we're better at avoiding climate change. Not everyone does. Secondarily, climate change isn't reversible, can't go back, therefore on your side of the house, huge harm. Finally, regulation, they've told us that we can regulate, i.e. climate change is bad, therefore we're passing laws right now. We're only doing that after climate change literally cannot be scientifically reversed, therefore that's not a response. Thank you very much.
Cool. I thank the speaker for their speech, and as per convention, we'll now reverse the speaking order, and I invite up Neg Reply.
If someone said, here, spin this wheel, you have a 90% chance you get $15 billion, but there's a 10% chance you and your family get hunted by the Terminator while you develop cancer from a nuclear fallout, I am most definitely choosing to stay in my current life, and all of that 10 billion actually isn't even real, right? What are we going to do here? We're going to talk about these 3 same points of clash, their big push on equality, which not only does not matter in the course of the debate, but we actually win and flip all of their points. Then we're going to talk about the second idea of the consequences. This is our first path to victory of the sort of negative, just semi-bad consequences that we think are more likely than the really, really horrifically bad consequences that we still think are likely and bad enough to mean we win this debate. Okay, equality, right? We've had 2 big pushes from the other side. Firstly, there's this idea of guilt. I think we've thoroughly responded to why guilt doesn't matter if you can't see the effects. I don't think we've heard proper response to that. I think we win that. Secondly, we've heard this idea that as society develops, they just tend to care more about social things. Again, I still don't fully understand how this happens. I don't think we've been told how this actually happens. Even if we assume it does, we think the idea that it's easier to revert back to old things than to break down new things is much, much more likely than whatever possible mech you as adjudicators might understand, right? Okay. But even after all of that, it doesn't even matter, again, because let's talk about the consequences that we weigh higher, because we think that when people are depressed because they have an AI girlfriend and can't talk to people in real life, we think that's more harmful than these unlikely effects, and that affects everyone, than these unlikely effects that we see on the other side, right? Basically, all of our mechs, all of our points here rely on the idea that there is going to be new technology, and that this means there is inherently a period of time where people have to adjust to this new technology, and this takes time. The only response, we've had 3 responses to this, right? Firstly, it's just they'll be able to change. I think we've given you mechs of why this happened, why just passing a bill is not good enough. Secondly, we've had this idea that companies want to do won't do bad things. I think we've given you very clear mechs of why they're companies are not aligned with the public good. And secondly, again, you don't need to believe that, because I'm most definitely sure that the terrorists who now are more likely to have access to nuclear bombs, to chemical weapons, to biological weapons, certainly do not have the best interest of the public in mind, right? Thirdly, and this is I think quite important for us to to talk about, is that it already exists, that the world is already bad. What we've told you, especially at third, but I think as well down the line, is that basically this technology, more technology, means it's easier to make new technology. This, richer get richer, there's going to be more and more of this technology. That means that there's a quicker pace of change. This means it's harder to adapt. This means all of these things that we've told you are really, really bad because we haven't dealt with social media, and now we've already got AI, and by the time we have started to deal with that, we're going to have gene editing, and it goes on and on and on, right? Thirdly, why does even if you don't believe all of that, it again not matter. We've talked about catastrophe. There is two different ways this happens. Firstly, the trickle down of you have terrorists who suddenly get a hold of things. This is obviously really, really bad. I don't think we've had responses to this because their whole case relies on this idea of trickle down. And so inherently, that's really good for us. Then there's this idea of AI and climate. Again, we've had this idea, and other possible things that we don't even know about. Again, we've had this idea that people will make just rules to deal with this. We've told you why that's not true, right? Why is this point so strong for us? Why is this case winning? Firstly, it's a lot of people. It's the whole world. Secondly, it's a lot of harm. Again, Terminator stuff. And then thirdly, because of all of those low harms, we don't have to prove it's likely. We have a really low burden because at the point where you believe it's a tiny percent, just like I said at the start of the debate, we obviously win this debate. Thank you very much.
I thank the speaker for their speech, and I invite up Af Reply to conclude the first round of nationals.
I think at the end of the day, we have given you a case that specifically tells you why time allows for better and more positive development for the most amount of people, but more specifically for those who are impoverished in our societies. A couple of things to talk about. Firstly, on the catastrophic events, secondly on innovation, and lastly on equality. Firstly, on the catastrophic events. I think firstly, before I begin to explain this point of clash, it's not fair for them to just say, no, we win this debate on the off chance of a 1% that the world ends up with a nuclear fallout. Why? Because they have to stand for the status quo, in which the alternative is that there is a large chance that you are born into complete poverty and famine, for example, in rural China. I think that they therefore have to prove that there is a high likelihood of a catastrophe occurring, or that it's likely to affect the majority of society, and I don't think they've done that today. Why? Firstly, because we have told you that there is unlikely to be true because of greater interconnectedness within our societies, because having more power means that more people are less likely and unlikely to use it. We know we gave you the example of the Cold War. Thirdly, because you have more preventative technology and analytic technology in order to prevent human loss, in order to respond to any sort of catastrophe. And you also have greater technological development, which ties into our later point on innovation, that it can be used by a variety of different communities in order to respond to any sort of catastrophe. So it's unlikely to occur, but any severity that they may talk about is likely to be minimised significantly in 100 years' time. On the comparative, some of these catastrophic events that they told you are likely to happen in the next 5 or 10 years, right? Without the existence of any of this technology. And we tell you that we would much rather prefer to live in 100 years after we have time to respond to this with all of our new developments and new knowledge and respond in a more positive way. Secondly then, on innovation. I think what we have told you at the end of this point is that innovation allows our entirety of society to improve, and it's independent from the equality point, and that if everyone improves, then the general quality of life improves, and therefore you would much prefer to be born in this world. Why do we get more innovation, and why is it better? Firstly, because it is more shared amongst society, it is cheaper, it is more environmentally friendly, it is more efficient, you have better knowledge, and you are building upon the ideas of the past in order to progress and move forward. I think when they tell you about all of the things that are harmful in society, like social media or things like AI, where we know what the harms are, they fail to deal with the fact that in 100 years, we also know all of these things and are therefore better able to account for them. We are able to improve on them even further. What do we get in at the end of the debate? We tell you that rather than the claims that they make about companies innovating specifically and trying to do harm, we get either A, companies wanting to create profit, which means that you can't destroy the world, or secondly, you get communities being able to use this innovation in order to benefit their own community, or you get countries regulating companies in order to ensure that the best possible innovation occurs. Also, furthermore, on the social media point, we've told you through this debate a lot about the sort of the most impoverished. These are like the largest group in society. When they tell you about the harms of social media, I think they really fail to deal with that fact, and they focus on the most developed in this world. But also that we have told you specifically throughout this debate why you're unlikely to get those unique harms of social media. Lastly, then, on equality, they gave a lot of benefit to equality in their final speech. But I also think that we are able to claim equality uniquely on our side of the house. Why? We told you that because people generally care and they have guilt and empathy, this means they uniquely want to have positive change, and overall society's trend in the future means that when we are able to use this time in order to benefit society, we get more positive change. Secondly, on the sort of economics mechanism, and that you're wanting to maximise utility, which means you're wanting to maximise the benefit for the most vulnerable people. You're wanting to improve the quality of life and make sure everybody is on a more equal footing. But lastly, which I don't think had a sufficient response to, voting power. We tell you that it's harder to take away political power from people in 100 years' time, which means they advocate for their rights, which means they're able to get better change that is going to benefit them. I think uniquely on our side of the house, equality is improved. We get better innovation for the largest number of people, and that is why we win this debate.
Cool. I thank everyone for what was a wonderful debate. I invite you guys to cross the floor, shake hands, and then step outside of the room while we deliberate.
Oh. Yeah, was that the best one? Oh my god. Yeah, I know. It's gonna be so